Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today we're going to be looking at the African Union 38th Summit, a part to security and economic integration, but we'll be looking at the African Union as a whole in general, its effectiveness and the challenges that it faces. I'm joined by a very special guest, Professor Babatunde Fagbayibo. Professor Babatunde Fagbayibo is a professor of international law at the University of Pretoria. His research focuses primarily on the institutional development of the African Union. He also writes and teaches and researches institutional. He also looks at African politics, transnational policy analysis, critical approaches to international law, governance, and democratization in Africa. Babatunde, I'm very, very pleased to have you join me. I need to apologize for the delay and the error on our part, but we're very, very pleased to have you join me, and I look forward to a wonderful conversation.
Yes, thank you, Michael. I'm also happy to be here. Yes, I look forward to this
Yes.
conversation.
Brilliant. So the first question that I'm going to ask is the African Union have just recently had its 38th summit, and the topic is an interesting one where they've looked at reparations for Africans and African people of African descent. What is the motivation behind this topic?
It is the whole question around reparation is something that has actually been on. It's a conversation that has been going on for several decades, even before the establishment of the Organization of African Unity in 1963. The first institutional response, at least to discussing the issue of reparation, at least having one kind of voice in dealing with reparation, was in 1993 when the Organization of African Unity, which is the predecessor of the current African Union, put together a group of experts to discuss the modalities, methods, and modalities of engaging in reparation, right? Dealing with external partners and how to quantify reparation for slavery, for colonialism, for even the theft of cultural artifacts and cultural heritage of the continent that has gone on for centuries. Those were, discussed in 1993, and there's a communique to that effect. We have had to wait from 1993 until 2025 to now, discuss this again, to put it on the front burner. Not that there have not been, discussions around it between 1993 and 2025. Of course, there have been discussions, there have been references made to it, but at least 2025 has now been solely dedicated to that. So we have to understand this dedication within the context of this long line of several activities by individuals, by organizations, by individual African countries. We've seen even repatriation of cultural artifacts to countries like Nigeria, for example, to Senegal, to Cameroon. That's been ongoing for in the past couple of years, and also different levels of conversation, even between Germany and Namibia, for,
Namibia.
for the genocide committed against the Herero and the Herero people, the Herero and Nama people in the early 1900s, right? And of course, there are debates around the figures and how much figures in terms of compensation for that, which is, many scholars, including myself, do not see as a serious approach to that kind of compensation. So you've had series of activities and discussions around that. And for us to also locate it within the context of the fact that the impact of slavery, the impact of colonialism actually did a lot of damage to the continent. You also had this kind of forceful dispersal of Africans. That's why you would, in North America, you have the African diaspora, the what you call the historic diaspora. Latin America, in the Caribbean, right, and all of those activities actually, which came about as a result of that of the slavery and colonialism. But again, also the work of it was also it was symbolically significant that the president of or the prime minister of Barbados, Prime Minister Motley, who is also the head of the CARICOM, heads of state, came to address African leaders at the 30th summit. Which is very, very important because she also represents the diaspora. She represents, that continued linkage between the continent and its diaspora. And again, CARICOM and the African Union have actually been in discussions over the years. They had the first summit, the first interregional summit in 2021. They are having the second one this year. And if you listen to her speech, he even recommended that should be held on the African continent, which is also very significant, symbolically significant. And CARICOM actually already has a 10-point plan of for reparation. So that's also very important, and to see how both organizations can continue to talk and synergize their efforts in terms of the issues of reparation. So it's a welcome development that the African Union at least has devoted this year to discussing those issues, and one looks forward to the activities around that, and to see whether or not the African Union would actually be serious about pushing for this, because we've waited until from 1993 until now. Not much has been done, even in terms of the 1993 communique by the group of experts on reparation. So hopefully, one can only hope that the African Union takes this seriously.
Brilliant. So what I get at now is we there's been a historical narrative or conversation regarding this topic, but we've seen a more heightened response to it in this year with the topic. So do you think this is also this recent surge in this narrative or this drive is driven by Africa's renewed or let me say renewed geopolitical interest in the geopolitical calculation of power? So what we're seeing right now, we're seeing different alignment of power, realignment of power, expansion of BRICS, expansion of NATO, G20. We're just seeing like the world, there seems to be a shift towards the new world, and Africa seems to be very, very important in that calculation. So do you think this recent surge, a drive towards reparation narrative is driven by this surge? And then again, would you also look at, I think you kind of slightly mentioned it, like the experiences of maybe blacks, if I using the Pan-African way, in America, in North America, in the Caribbean, do you think the experiences they are facing is also making them is it driving this collaboration or this quest collaboration with the African continent?
You see, there might be some sort of overlapping. So I start with your first question. There might be some sort of overlapping trends or kind of streams between this reparation, this quest for reparation, and changing global dynamics. But again, these are also kind of, they might overlap on on certain fronts, but these are also two distinct kind of engagements, right? So the idea of reparation is to correct the imbalances, right? Is to correct the damaging impact of slavery, the impact it has had on our economies, the impact it has had on political life, and also to what to strive for wholeness in the words of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the writer, say, we have to remember, the dismembered, right? I mean, we've been dismembered through colonialism, through slavery, and all of those things. But we are on the quest for wholeness, or what Wole Soyinka even calls cosmic totality, right? We have to also to look at the spiritual element of it, kind of a continent that has lost part of it. There's been this forced dispersal of its people, and the kind of the violation of also the spirituality of the continent by taking from it, taking its cultural artifacts, taking its people, damaging its soil, and all of those things, right? So we see it in that context. Now, we are saying that if we want to correct the imbalances, if we want things to at least go back, the equilibrium in the international kind of thing, you have to for us to negotiate better as equals, for us to be able to come to the table as equal members of this global committee of nations or global community, right? We need to restore. Then we need to restore the balance. We need to correct the imbalances, right? That's that's important. I mean, no one should argue against that. And to also hold people accountable, right? It goes beyond merely saying we are sorry, nothing comes from it, right? So that is it, right? But again, the reason why I've said we should also be very careful not to conflate things is that we should also understand that there are processes that the African Union itself has actually put in place. So certain processes have put in place in the past couple of years through its reform processes, right, to seek to correct the injustices, the imbalances in the global economic architecture, right? To say that the global economic architecture does not favor Africa, that we need to start rethinking the reforms of the international financial institutions. We need to reform global financial architecture to ensure that some people are not, the debt on many African countries, the fact that the repayment of debt actually take a huge chunk of their national fiscus. In fact, there was a report in 2020 by Global Jubilee that shows that certain African countries actually pay more in terms of servicing their debt than on health, on the health for their populace. So they are, engaging in servicing the debt and not investing in health, in national health structures. And also the fact that many African countries, even countries in the global south, actually pay more in terms of more interest on their repayment than even the wealthier countries in the global north. So all of these injustices, so if we look at all of these things, then we start to understand. I mean, we could also perhaps let me agree with you to a certain extent on the point of reparation. So this is also part of reparation, right? It's also part of repairing, right? Of repairing the injustices, be it in terms of economic injustice or political injustice, and also the fact that we need to reform the United Nations Security Council, right? And this is a course that the African Union has been on at least since the release of its Ezuluni consensus in 2005 on trying to reform the United Nations. That also includes the diversity and also includes all African countries as part of the UN Security, permanent members of the UN Security Council. So these are important things to to look at. And I think your next question was on the diasporas, right?
Yeah.
Whether there's so there's always, I mean, the interesting thing is that even the whole context of Pan-Africanism started from the diaspora. So the diaspora and elites were at the forefront of it. You know, think of all the
Dubois and the rest. Yeah.
exactly, Marcus Garvey. You know,
right.
so think of all of those. So they've always been at the forefront of this whole discourse around thing, even around reparation. African diasporans have always played a critical role, and that is why the African Union even recognized in 2006 the African diaspora as the sixth region of the African Union. You know, I mean, Haiti actually took the AU on that in 2012 by applying to be a member of the African Union. Of course, they were denied on technicality as Article 29 of the African Union Constitutive Act, which I have described in in some of my works as saline, what Wole Soyinka refers to as saline consciousness. That is, it's only countries within the territory of the continent can apply to be members. But at some point, maybe we would see the kind of amendment of Article 29 to allow for, if one listens to Miyamoto's speech at the 38th African Summit, she actually said it. She talks about unity, how we need to take unity more seriously. She even goes to the extent of saying, "Call me naive." She says, "Yeah, you can call me naive for believing in unity, in the unity of this continent with its diasporans, right?" We should start taking these things more seriously. But I'm happy, and I'm glad at least that we are seeing this kind of
conversation
towards it. But I think I'd mentioned it to say that she also said that the next Africa CARICOM summit, the interregional summit, will be
happening in the continent,
and perhaps more of these discussions that we're even talking about here will be better ventilated at that summit when it is finally.
Yes. We'll definitely bring you back to when that happens. But what I want to discuss now is that the African Union itself, with all these. So what I found very, very interesting, or sometimes contradictory, is on one hand why we want to be equal partners or equal members, of this global architecture of whether economics or whatever it is. We also, Africa as a whole, even African Union itself, has always been in that dependent status, whether depending on the EU for its funding, whether also in a way justifying or defending the colonial legacies of that we've inherited, either through. So I think the African Union policy kind of kicks against secession. We've seen places that we can see the Somaliland, we can see some places in Western Sahara. We see all these kind of places. So if we look at all of these paradoxes, how do we reconcile that against the drive towards more independence, towards being on equal footing and independent partners? How do you reconcile all of that paradox?
Yes. I mean, look, the reality is this. We they all say the cliche, charity begins at home, and the AU needs to take itself more seriously. That's a fact. It needs to take itself more seriously, because there is no way one can engage in serious conversations about continental integration or regional integration, effective regional or transformative regional integration on the continent, by only looking at external factors, right? Internal factors are even much more important. You need to build resilience from within. You need to build a much stronger footing before you are able to negotiate, or before you're able to even assert yourself externally better. There's I have always argued that the African Union cannot continue to outsource Pan-Africanism. And what do I mean by that? By outsourcing Pan-Africanism is by essentially relying extensively on external donors to fund your project. to fund the so-called Pan-African project. All right. So we need to take ourselves much more seriously. You cannot outsource Pan-Africanism, just like Europeans cannot outsource Europeanism, or the whole project, European integration. Right? You need to engage in that. Right? You need to sort out the internal contradictions, the internal coherence, or the disruptions internally. And it starts by being more serious about financing yourself, financing. And there have been reforms over the years, obviously, about financing the organization. So there have been more stricter sanctions against member states that do not comply with their paying of their dues. They've been suspended, and some are paid back, and all of those things. And also in terms of, and of course, we all know how how the lack of proper self-financing also inhibits the African Union from being an effective and assertive organization. It's a very expensive project. Continental integration is extremely expensive. Not only do you need to finance your project, finance running of the organization, you also need to finance the programs of the organization, right? So those are very, very, very important things, and that it's not as a 2024 the assessed contributions to member states of the African Union, the entire 55, the assessed contribution was just $200 million. That was the assessed contributions, which is paltry for a serious, and the remaining $390 million, if I'm not mistaken, 391 was expected to be contributed by external partners, right? So bringing the total budget of the organization to about $601 million, which is,
which is quite small, insignificant,
which is paltry for running that organization. And even as of that, some member states still don't pay their dues. So it's very important that we take that seriously. It's also very important that we also take implementation of regional integration processes seriously. Think of free movement of persons that we've been talking about. Ours still remains the most closed continent in the world. The most closed continent, meaning that an average African like you and I mean, if you don't have a European passport that allows you travel, if you have an European passport, then you're able to travel freely across the continent. But if you don't have that, if you only have an African passport,
across which continent? African continent?
Yes, if you have an European passport.
I was going to come to that and talk about that in a minute.
Yes, it allows you. But I'm saying, if you don't have an European passport, either as an African or as a European, if you only have an African passport, then you require a visa to visit at least 47% of 55 EU member states. That's very high. So we still, the highest use of visa is still, we still find it on this continent, and only 5 countries have actually allows for grants has no visa regime or policy for the Africans. Rwanda, Seychelles, the Gambia, Ghana was the latest, and Benin Republic as well. So you see, these are some of the things we need to take seriously. Implementation. The outgoing chairperson of the African Union, Musa Faki Mahamat, had said it at the summit last year that between 2021 and 2023. 93% of the decisions of the African Union were violated by member states. 93%. That's a sign of unseriousness of the project we have created that is expected to move this continent forward. Powers have not been transferred. Significant powers have not been transferred to members of the African Union, organs of the African Union. Pan-African Parliament still remains a talking shop. It has no powers. The African Union Commission itself, which is described as the engine room of the organization, has little to no powers. And Musa Faki Mahamat said all of those things at least on 2 occasions last year to the African leaders and at the 20-year celebration of the African Union Peace and Security Council. I think he even said If why have you created these institutions when you don't have any interest in transferring powers to them? So I think those are we need to be more serious about the internal coherence of the organization, internal coherence and competence of the institutions of what we have created. Yes.
I would start from Frantz Fanon.
Yeah.
So when Frantz Fanon's criticism of the independence that Africans got, and they talk about is just flag waving, and the
Yes.
Africans are not truly independent. So, and then again, if you look at the continent, we say maybe in the last 60-something years that most African countries have gained independence. You look at it, are we really independent? And then if you're looking at, so you look at some of the revolutions, if we can call it revolutions, that is happening in the francophone countries, where in the Sahel you see France is receding. France, lingering influence is beginning to you see that some of these countries are putting France away. So I want to link that. I'm going somewhere. And then if you look at, I was recently watching a documentary about Wodemaya, the guy that does this, and he was trying to go from Zambia to Zimbabwe, and he couldn't. There's a visa, forgotten the name now, that allows you to go visa free to these 5 countries, but you must be European. So I'm just agreeing with what you're saying. Even as an Africans, you don't have access to that. It's only Europeans that have that. So I'm tying that into what might be holding the African Union. Is it that still colonial mentality? Are we still hampered by that? Are we still? So if you look again at the aid dependency, and then I want to tie it into what is currently happening. So the question would be: is what Trump did in terms of suspending aid? I'm looking at it indirectly. It might be a blessing in disguise. Because I think, so I guess the question is, do you think that African Union is affected by that invincible, I'll call it invincible, even though it's very visible, that invincible kind of dependency on these former colonial masters, that we've not really gained independence, and there might be a revolution going on, and Trump's protectionist policy might be helping to push towards that?
That's a very very loaded. I don't even know where to start with answering. It's a very big question. But anyways, look, the reality is that we have the primary obligation to fund our development. The primary obligation is on us, isn't it? The obligation on funding our development is on us. And one of the things I've always said is that by relying on external donors to fund our developmental objectives, our regional integration and all of those things, we're also exposing ourselves to the vulnerabilities and the shock in those systems. So now, while, for example, the cutting of aid by Trump will not really affect the operations of the African Union, because the US is not one of the major funders of the organization. While it might not affect it, at least on a very big, massive scale, but the European Union remains one of our biggest funders. So what happens if there is yes, exactly. So you are beginning to understand what I'm trying to say, even in terms of exposing ourselves to. You see, the rise of far-right parties is not only within the US. We also have it across Europe. It's spreading like wildfire. Now, if you have sufficient numbers of right-wing parties sitting at the table and being able to control budgetary issues, especially in terms of funding aid and all of those things to the African Union, or financing, then we're in big trouble. Some might think it will not really affect those funding, but anyways, I mean, we are already seeing what is happening in the US, the shock in terms of that. Then perhaps the next part of your question is this a wake-up call? I'm hoping. I'm hoping that this should be some sort of blessing in disguise, a wake-up call for us to be like, okay, how do we begin to plug the holes? How do we begin to be assertive and take control of our of our developmental project, which primarily should actually be on us, right? How do we begin to see that? But my fear is that do we have the political elite that see this as blessing in disguise, or will this be another talk shop where we say it that this is a blessing in disguise and we should, right? And of course, it's only in rhetoric, right? Nothing, there's no significant follow up on that. So that is my fear, right? Because you also need a very critical political elite that sees this and kind of sees this as a call for action and get to the drawing table ASAP on handling the shortfall and saying that perhaps we need to start cutting our clothes. You know, they say cut your cloth according to your size. But I say no, cut your cloth according to your cloth, because you might not be able to afford your size. So perhaps we see elite who now take this seriously, and not only national elite, even transnational elite, who see this as an important wake-up call and say, let's cut our cloth according to our cloth. What are the projects we can manage? How do we scale up? How do we begin to look for alternatives? And in doing this, so it's very, very important. I mean, it's a very important conversation, but only time will tell, right? Only time will tell. It's still in the early stages of it.
There's something you mentioned that very interesting. I'm glad you mentioned it now. So it ties into the question I was going to ask you. So you look at Africa, look at post-colonial Africa. The problem we've had, it's we see elite. We see some kind of like elite politics where nation building, maybe because of the colonial legacies, nation building was not really the thing. So you see the disconnection between the leaders and the people. But we're beginning to see, because you're saying that we need critical political elites. So if I look at the AU, one of the criticisms that I've seen somewhere is like this AU is driven by your with the heads of states making all of this stuff. So it's more like this is moribund. You have some of these older people making decisions for a very young continent, a continent with very teeming youth population. So now I'm seeing some kind of revolution in the continent, whether you go to Kenya, you go to the Sahel, you go to South Africa, you go to Mozambique recently, you go to Botswana, where we see that the old guard are beginning to lose is, that old guard that were fighting colonialism, those structures, they're beginning, the youth now don't have that memory. So they want good things, they want opportunities, they're not seeing it. So are we beginning to see such revolution? Does the AU need injection of look at the youth and look at injection of new ideas, fresh ideas? And then I could tie that into Senegal. Look at the youngest president. So we can begin to see, are we beginning to see that snippet of that happening? Or is that what it needs? Does the AU need injection of fresh ideas from its teeming youth population?
I mean, look, the average age of African leaders is 63. Right? That's the average age, 63. So now you ask yourself, for a continent that is regarded as the youngest continent in the world, right? And the average age of its leader is 63. That's an anomaly as a matter of fact. So now, but again, we are seeing, bits and pieces of young people protesting, but I would not go to the extent of saying that we are seeing a coordinated kind of resurgence of young people. Now, but before I get to that, maybe I should first say, yes, the AU needs fresh ideas. No doubt about that. It needs fresh ideas. And again, those fresh ideas do not necessarily only come from young people, right? So we can't also see young people as a monolith, right? As a monolithic group, saying all young people would automatically have fresh ideas. Of course, you need fresh ideas from a diverse group. right? So it can include older people, it can include women, it should include women, obviously.
Yeah.
The AU is also very critical about that. At least one of the good things about the AU is that if you look at its organizational dynamics, it takes gender equality more seriously in terms of representation of officials, right? It needs young people, it needs it needs a diverse, very diverse group of people with fresh ideas, people who are very serious, who understand and who take this project of Pan-Africanism very, very seriously, who, as a canon, right? Very seriously, and as an article of faith, right? No doubt about that. We need that. Now, to the question of whether we are seeing, and as I said earlier, that I don't think it is coordinated. It's all, these are, issues, and they are to be commended, by the way. I mean, for example, in Senegal, how young people were able to democratically assert themselves and to say, listen, in spite of everything, in spite of the fact that the incumbent did practically everything to frustrate, right? Even the so-called, both Faye and Soko were in jail. I mean, he had actually literally jailed Soko to the point where they had to put in Faye to at least stand for the elections, right? So one has to commend that, right? But we should also be very, very careful not to in our quest for fresh ideas, for young to not over glorify autocrats. Not everything that comes in the form of youth, not everything that comes in the form of military
Populism.
or populism, military khakis, right? I mean, West Africa is replete. I mean, you and I grew up under military dictatorship, isn't it? Yeah. We've been here. We've seen military dictators come and go. They've come as fresh-faced, as the savior, and all of those things. And of course, the joys of newness suddenly, devolves into, sad and what Fela Kuti aptly termed that sorrow, tears, and blood.
Tears and blood.
Yes, exactly. So we need to, be very, very careful. But we need to also assert democratization. Democratization, I mean, if you look at polls continue to show that the majority of peoples on this continent want democracy. Well, they want democracy. Of course, they are also not happy about, this so-called civilian coups. We need to also criticize civilian coups, because if not for this so-called civilian coups and corruption, right, we would not have what we currently have in the situation now we're having in the coup belt. So we need to understand all of those things. But as part of developing our continent, as part of taking our continent forward, as part of asserting or centering meaningful transformative democratization, we cannot afford to take away the voices of our teeming population. We cannot, any project, any system, no matter how charismatic it is, no matter how populist it is, that tries to bury the voices of our people, of the masses of our people, that tries to subvert it and say, oh yes, democracy is democracy is not important now. We are going to deal with the stomach now, and all of those things, right? That comes in that, guys, should be totally rejected, because it is not compatible with transformative regionalism. It is not compatible.
Let's wind down. I know we've talked about this in the questions, but I wanted to give you opportunity for the last question to give like a summarized response to the factors that are or the challenges, let's put it that way, that is affecting the African Union in exerting his position to bring about prosperity to the continent, and how the second leg will be what does he need to do? I know you've mentioned all of this, but it's just in a very concise, summarized way to what are the things that he needs to do to get to where he needs to be very, very effective, to realize prosperity and realize and also we fight for the reparation And
Yes.
we also need to take account that we've got, for instance, we've got looted funds that have come back. And how
Yes.
do we how do you account, how are those looted funds being
Accounted for.
redistributed for accounted for? Again, we could talk about that, but we're not talking about the management. So I
Yes.
wanted you to look at all of this in conclusion.
Yes. So I'll go back to what I've called what I call the three C's, right? What I call competition, coordination, and competence. And I'll briefly, because I know we have a few minutes left. So competition. There's the ongoing, and we've spoken about the ongoing global competition and all of those things, this global dynamics, and all of those things, right? How do we effectively manage this? We have to, and it's very important. How do we manage? I mean, there's this kind of surge in the interest for our critical minerals. Everybody is now organizing Africa Plus One Summit. Canada just came out like a few days ago with its Africa strategy. We have all of these things. There's global competition. We're seeing it. There's this thing. But how do we manage this competition to the extent that it benefits us? It's very, very important. And the African Union has to be capacitated to be able to do that. Because these three C's I'm talking about are interrelated and connected, right? So global competition, understanding global competition and seeing how we manage that, which leads to the next one, that is coordination, right? You cannot manage competition without having effective and meaningful coordination. You negotiate with one voice, you create a coordinative platform, and the African Union is one of the best ways of doing that. Right? So we coordinate, and all of the things the African Union is doing, be it through its constitutive act or through its policies or through its activities, are geared towards this. Of course, more needs to be done about that, right? In terms of coordinating its efforts, so that we speak with one voice on the global platform and are able to negotiate better for the continent, right? That's the second C. So then we move to the third C, right? We cannot do all of these things without talking about the third C, which is competence. If you have not granted African Union the necessary competence, if you have not endowed it with the sufficient competence, it is not going to be able to coordinate effectively, right? So it can understand that there's global competition, but if it does not have competence, it cannot coordinate. Because what we are dealing with right now is that we do not have a robust coordination mechanism. Yes, it is part of the AU reform processes, and it is where we are going to. It is aspirational, but we need to, transform rhetoric, words into action, right? And we cannot do that if we do not grant this institution we have created, that is over 20 years in existence now, with a meaningful competence to be able to address and handle many of our problems. And I think that's very important. If you look at these three C's, you'll see that even within that coordinating mechanism, it's able to handle issues of financing itself, is able to handle issues of security, increasing insecurity across these wildfires of insecurity from Sudan, which is currently the
South Sudan.
South Sudan is also burnt in like
DRC.
DRC, and also the Coup Belt. I mean, which is the terrorism in the Sahel and all of those things. Like them, as Bob Marley said, there's so much trouble in the world. I mean, that song. The more I listen to it, the more you think it was written literally yesterday. So much trouble in the world. How do we handle all of these things? So I think it's very, very important. And essentially, we need to take ourselves more seriously, and the African Union needs to replace this dysfunctional worldview of African states to world affairs, to global affairs, needs to replace it with a more meaningful, progressive mindset. And you cannot have a progressive mindset, a progressive worldview, without handling internal incoherence, internal inefficiencies, strengthening yourself from the inside to be able to engage meaningfully externally.
Brilliant. Well, we'll try and leave it at that. I was just wondering to myself that I didn't pronounce it very well, and I should do better. Is Fagbayibo?
No, it's Fagbayibo.
Fagbayibo.
Fagbayibo. Yes.
Fagbayibo. Okay.
Fagbayibo. Yes.
Fagbayibo, yes. Sorry about
Fagbayibo.
that.
Not a problem.
Thank you. Thank you
Not
very
a
much. I know
problem.
that there's some words that has been left out, but yes, that is
Yes.
Fagbayibo. Okay, I know
Fagbayibo.
I was pronouncing the way, and I should have done better. But I'm very, very grateful for
Thank you.
for
Thank
your
you for having me as well.
insightful, for your insightful
Thank you.
views on these, and I share most of your views, and also
Thank you.
criticism and optimism as well. We can't only criticize; we also have to share optimism that things will
That's
get
true.
better.
That's true.
Yes, we're grateful. We're gonna have to get you back soon once there's development with this. Maybe when they have this
The
Caribbean
African Union
African Union
CARICOM.
stuff, and then
Yes.
we can see how that goes. But in the
Yes, and
meantime,
we'll talk about that. Thank you.
yeah, we thank you very much, and
Thank
have
you.
a lovely day. Yeah,
You too.
bye.
You too. Thank
Yeah,
you. Bye.
bye. Oh, thank you very much for joining us today. As usual, join me to thank our guest, Professor Babatunde Fagbayibo, for his very useful comments and views and critical assessment of the African Union, especially its recent Summit 38 summit that looks at a reparation for African people of African descent. Stay blessed, and I'll see you next week. Bye.